secretary. And she said, Jose is worried about you. He knows you're in social circle. Well, he sent you. And Monroe, back and forth to Monroe, back and forth. You know, he knows where you are. He needs you in Atlanta tonight to come to Memphis. And she said, I think Willie Bolin is coming to Memphis tonight. You need to come with Bolin. I said, okay, I'm going back to Atlanta. So I drove out of social circle, and I parked the car that I was driving, a rental car that they assigned me. I parked it at 334 Auburn Avenue next door to this building, and I walked into the headquarters, and Claudette Matthews said, I don't know how you got here so quick. Seemed like I just spoke to you a minute ago. I said, yeah, I'm ready to go to Memphis. And I was crying, you know, I was devastated. I was just upset, you know, I was just like, I thought when that bullet hit Dr. King, when I heard Chet Huntley and Walter Cronkite say that Dr. King was dead, I really felt like I died. And I sat in the lobby of SCLC's headquarters, and Willie Bolin finally came in, and he said, we're going to Memphis together. He and Gwen had a white Thunderbird, and kind of a new car. It might have been brand new. We had a new smell. And I said, let me drive it to Memphis. And so he got on the back seat. Gwen stayed on the passenger side. She was reading a book. And I drove that car all the way to Memphis that night. I drove it all the way. I was running 100 miles, 110, 120, whatever that car would do. Every now and then, Bolin would wake up and touch me on my shoulder and says, please slow down. We're going to get to Memphis. Please slow down. I said, okay. I drove that car all the way to Memphis. We got to Memphis at 2 a.m. in the morning, and Memphis was burning. I didn't know it then. I found out maybe 5, 6 years ago doing an interview with Jim Auchmuty at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution headquarters down at 72 Marietta Street. He was interviewing me because the AJC was doing a special section on Dr. King's assassination. They had interviewed Dr. Joe Lowry, Ambassador Andrew Young, Reverend C.T. Vivian, Congressman John Lewis, Reverend Bernice King, and he said, we want to interview you because you were the youngest staff member on Dr. King's staff the day he was killed. And we know you were in Walton County, Social Circle, Monroe. So when I got down to 72 Marietta Street, the first thing he said before he started the interview, he said, I just want you to know, we have your timeline when you left Atlanta going to Memphis that night. We know you drove Willie Bolin's car. He said, we know what time you left. He said, but we also have James Earl Ray's timeline where he left Memphis coming into Georgia. And he said, I want you to know you all passed each other that night. You going to Memphis, he's coming to Atlanta. You all passed each other on the highway just like that. I said, what? He said, yeah. I immediately called Willie Bolin, who was pastoring a church over in Cedartown, Georgia, to tell him that this reporter was informing me that when I was driving his car to Memphis that night, April 4, 1968, that we met James Earl Ray and didn't even know it. What I have now discovered is that James Earl Ray was coming into Georgia, and he came into Atlanta. He drove from Atlanta over to Social Circle, then Monroe, then through a little community called Gratis. Then he went up to Winder, came out of Winder back to Atlanta, and he parked his 1965 Mustang over at what was then Capitol Homes Housing Project next to the state capitol. I discovered this on June the 9th of 2014 from a former law enforcement officer who lives in Walton County. He called me to just talk to me, and he started talking about the fact that his daughter had just met me on June 6th when I spoke at the State Bar Convention down on Amelia Island, Florida. And he said, I just want to share this with you because you may not know it. And I asked him, how did he know all this? And he said, I told you I was in law enforcement when you all were working in Walton County. And I said, what, are you federal, or are you state, or are you local? And he said, I just can't talk about that, Tyrone. He said, at some point, I'll get a chance to talk to you. You can come over and we'll talk. He said, but right now, I don't want to be in the newspapers. I don't want to be on TV. I'm not seeking any media coverage. He said, but my daughter heard you speak at the State Bar Convention down in Amelia Island, Florida. She's very impressed, and y'all took pictures. And he said, I've seen the photographs, but that was something that just kind of connected to what I had already been told by this reporter from the AJC. But the real story that we're working on right now, the real mission, not only is to follow up on what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. started in Monroe with the Moores Ford Bridge lynching. 1946, when Dr. King got word that these African Americans had been lynched and massacred, Dr. King was 17 years old. He was very, very upset about it. He was outraged. He started writing letters to the president, members of Congress, law enforcement, media, particularly the black press. He was 17 years old, student at Morehouse. Dr. King's letters began to get published. The Atlanta Constitution carried one of his letters, which we have found in the archives. Dr. King was writing about Moore's Ford's massacre. He was writing about Maceo Snipes being lynched in Butler, Georgia, at the age of 17. So Dr. King carried this with him all the way to Memphis when he was assassinated. He had it in his heart. And so after the assassination of Dr. King, and after we went through the Poor People's Campaign March on Washington, and after we got resettled in the South, 1981, I got a call from Mr. Dan Young, who buried the victims at the Moore's Ford Bridge. Mr. Young was one of those undertakers who stayed in touch with us. And Mr. Young called me and he said, "Son, I know you just got elected to the Georgia House of Representatives." He said, "I know you're busy." He said, "But I need you and Jose Williams to come back to Monroe." I said, "Why?" He said, "There's a young soldier missing. His name is Lynn McKinley Jackson." He said, "We can't find him." I said, "How old is he?" He said, 22 years old. He said he came home on leave and he hadn't reported back to Fort Bragg. He is he's going to be AWOL. And he said, "We're worried about him." I said, "Mr. Young, he's going to show up, and when he goes back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, they're going to bust him, put him in the brig, whatever." He said, "That boy is not like that, Tyrone. He's a very responsible young man. He's kind of like you." He said, he is not going to do something like that." He said, "We're worried about him because he dates a white girl that lives here." They were in high school together. When they finished high school, they continued to see each other. He went off to the Army, but every time he come home, people see them together. He loves motorcycles, and the girl would be on the motorbike with him, riding, all around Monroe, Atlanta, Athens, whatever. He said, "We believe something has happened based on his relationship with this white girl." So I went over to Monroe to meet Mr. Young. Then I called United States Senator Mac Mattingly, who had just won his seat in the United States Senate the same year that I won mine in the Georgia House. I called Senator Mattingly to ask him if he could do anything he could do to help this community who was searching for this soldier. And Senator Mattingly said to me, he said, "I'm very familiar with Monroe and Walton County." He said, "I wasn't born in the South." He said, "But I've read about Monroe, Georgia, man, for a long time, the history of lynchings and violence." He said, "Let me see what I can do." The next day, Mr. Young called me up, and he said, "I don't know what you've done, but there are all kinds of agents all over this county looking for this soldier." I said, "Great." I said, "The only thing I did was call United States Senator Mac Mattingly." So they found Lynn's body hanging in a tree, 20 feet up, rope around his neck, way out in the woods between Monroe and Social Circle off of Arnold Dairy Pond Road. Mr. Young called me up. I drove to Social Circle. He took me and Robert Howard and Lurie Maddox out to the tree where Lynn's body was found. Mr. Young had to take the body to his funeral home and get, prepare it for funeral. Now, Lynn's body was badly decomposed, and the vultures had really destroyed the body. But down on the ground around that tree where he was hanging, someone had poured gasoline all around that tree, the bottom of that tree, all around the base of that tree, and set it afire to burn up evidence. It was all black. And Mr. Young said they tried to burn up the evidence. Well, there was an inquest held at the Walton County Courthouse, downtown Monroe on Broad Street. I went to the inquest. It was a jam-packed hearing on that day in that courthouse. Federal officials took up one half of the courthouse on the right-hand side when you walk in. Local officials took up the other side. You walk in, they were on the left. And the federal government took the position this young soldier was lynched. The local people took the position that he had committed suicide. So there was no resolving of that issue. What we decided to do was protest this lynching. And so on February 20th, 1982, a Saturday morning at 10 a.m., we gathered at the traffic light in downtown Social Circle. I had asked Dr. Ralph Abernathy to lead a march from Social Circle to Monroe to protest the lynching of Lynn McKinley Jackson. So we gathered at the traffic light that morning, and when we arrived, there were over 200 Ku Klux Klansmen across the street at this Standard or Gulf service station across the street, waving the big Confederate battle flags and screaming the N-word and screaming at the white people who were in our march, getting ready to march from Social Circle to Monroe. And it was about, I don't know, 400 or 500 state troopers, it seemed like to me, out there blocking the Klan and our group from mingling with each other, because it was going to be a lot of violence if they hadn't. The Ku Klux Klan was on one side of the road, we were on the other side, and the troopers were right in the middle. And the troopers made it plain that they were going to escort us all the way to Monroe. That's 11 miles. Dr. Abernathy flew in from the United Nations. He was driven in by Lester Courtney, who was a member of his church. And we put Dr. Abernathy right up front. Willie Bolden's little baby girl, Felicia, she was 6 years old, and she was holding my hand while I gave Bolden the bullhorn. And we were walking up the road. She got tired. I put her on my shoulders, and I started carrying her. And Bolden said I carried her all the way to Monroe, but I think she walked some and I carried her some. As we walked all the way to Monroe that day, and more Klansmen just kept coming. We got into the city of Monroe, and the streets were just jam-packed, just like a greeting for President Obama or some president of the United States. There was huge crowds on the sidewalk. They had to block the traffic, send the traffic around Monroe, so many people, thousands of people. I took Dr. Abernathy up to the steps of the courthouse. He got on the top step, and he began to speak after I introduced him. I think Willie Bolden might have introduced me. I introduced Dr. Abernathy. And Dr. Abernathy began to talk about the fact that he and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were coming to Monroe at the request of Mr. Dan Young on April 4th, 1968. But his best friend in the world, Martin Luther King Jr., was murdered in Memphis. Couldn't come, of course. That set us back, but he was there now